Hi everyone, my name is Christina Gomez and I'm a librarian at Milwaukee Public Library. I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon as New York Times bestselling author Larry Tye chats with Milwaukee Journal Sentinel arts and books editor Jim Higgins about his new biography of Joe McCarthy. If you don't currently own your own copy of Larry's book, Demagogue, The Life and Long Shadow of Senator Joe McCarthy, we encourage you to order through Milwaukee's independently owned bookstore, Boswell Book Company. We will include a link in the chat box where you can order directly from Boswell Books. They have home delivery available, or you can order through curbside pickup. I want to share just a couple of technology tips for this webinar. Right now, as audience members, all of your microphones are muted and your webcams are off. During the presentation, you can submit questions for Larry using the question box that should be part of your webinar screen. If you're using a smartphone or a tablet, the question box may appear as a question mark. The chat box should also be listed under the settings where you can see a couple of links. My colleague Anna and I will be behind the scenes to help with any technology issues you may have. Just go ahead and enter those in the question box and then we will help you out. And now actually I'm going to hand things over to Jim Higgins. Thank you, Jim, for joining us today for this author visit.
Thank you, Christina and Anna. I'm happy to be here with the Milwaukee Public Library and friends of the Milwaukee Public Library. Welcome, Larry.
Thank you, Jim.
We talked a few weeks ago for a story about your book about Joe McCarthy, who of course is one of the both more famous and notorious elected officials to ever come from Wisconsin. But we should tell people that this isn't your first rodeo, that you were a Boston Globe reporter specialized in health and medicine, and you've written a number of biographies, including ones of Satchel Paige, the baseball star, and Bobby Kennedy. So Larry, just set us up a little bit. How did you come to write a bio of Joe McCarthy?
So it was partly that when I was writing a book on Bobby Kennedy, I interviewed 450 people, and the only one probably of that group was truly essential was Ethel Kennedy, Bobby's widow, and at the time of his death, the most popular woman in America. And Ethel Kennedy said something about Joe McCarthy that stuck with me forever, and it was that Joe McCarthy might be a monster to much of America, but to Bobby and Ethel, he was just plain good fun. Now, I've heard a lot of adjectives used to describe Joe McCarthy. The idea of good fun wasn't among them. And I thought there's got to be a side to this guy that history has missed out on and that I'm intrigued by. I also signed up a week before the 2016 election to write a biography of Barack Obama. And the day after the election, I realized that we won't know Obama's legacy until the end of the era of Trump, but that suddenly the Joe McCarthy story, which looked like a story of ancient history, the election of Donald Trump made clear it was the story of today. So partly Ethel Kennedy, partly Donald Trump, and here it is.
All right, Larry, this might be obvious to you and I, but we may have some younger listeners here today. Could you just recap briefly why Joe McCarthy is important?
So he is important partly because he is the embodiment, even though he wasn't the originator of the Red Scare of the 1950s. He was the red baiting senator who took the fear that Americans had in 1950 and played on it in a way that showed no bounds in terms of telling the truth and no bounds in terms of his opportunism. At the moment that Joe McCarthy launched his crusade against communism, to remind people who lived through that era, and more importantly, people who didn't, Americans were afraid enough of the Soviet Empire that we had just watched nationalist China become Red China. We had just watched the atomic spies Julius and Ethel Rosenberg be captured, be tried, and be sentenced to death. And we were so afraid of what was going on in terms of this Soviet threat that we were about to teach our kids something that it is extraordinary to think of. We were about to teach them that in the event of an atomic attack from the Soviet Union, all they had to do was put their hands over their head and duck under their desks. It was called the Duck and Cover program, and they would be safe from an atomic attack. And that is the fear that McCarthy played on, and that is the fear that America was gripped by at that moment in 1950.
So as you have been generous enough to point out in many of your interviews, this isn't the first bio of McCarthy. What do you bring to a study of his life that past biographers didn't bring?
So Jim Higgins is a terrific reporter for the Milwaukee newspaper, and he's also a diplomatic guy. And what he really meant to ask was, why does the world need the 101st biography of Joe McCarthy? And the answer is, we probably don't, except for the fact that there is extraordinary new material that changes our sense of just who McCarthy was. And that material comes in 3 different sets. It comes in the 9,000 pages of transcripts of all the hearings that Joe McCarthy held behind closed doors. 2/3 of his hearings he locked the public out of and locked the press out of. And in those hearings, Joe McCarthy came unhinged. He stopped even pretending to care about rights of the accused. He would grill witnesses in a way that he was using these closed door hearings as a test for the witnesses who could stand up under his grilling, and they never showed up in public hearings. But the ones who caved into him did show up when he invited back in the press and the public. And we saw one last thing when he held these closed door hearings and they gave us a new take on Joe McCarthy. We saw that in the morning when he was sober, he was relatively rational. In the afternoon, after he had had his trademark lunch of a hamburger, a raw onion, and plenty of whiskey, he would lose his temper instantaneously. And by the way, I hope I'm not making people nauseous. I don't know whether you're seeing the same version of me fading in and out, but I'm trying to stay calm and steady so that the camera won't do that. So that was one set of documents that give us a new take on who Joe McCarthy was. Those papers were embargoed for 50 years, and several years before I started my book, they were released, and nobody had ever taken a deep dive into those 9,000 pages. A second set of documents were McCarthy's medical records and his Marine Corps files. And those, again, were never made public until I was writing this book. For some reason, the military decided to let me see those, and those showed Joe McCarthy to be the alcoholic that we had always suspected that he was. They did everything from quantify the levels of his drinking before he was censured and after he was censured. They showed that while the official coroner's report listed his cause of death as being acute hepatitis, the real cause of death, that was a diplomatic answer to try to protect his family from the stigma of drinking yourself to death. But there was no doubt that that's precisely what he did. They showed the last 2 days of his death, an orderly was at his side, taking down every ranting and raving that he indulged in. And they show a different sense of what was controlling Joe McCarthy's behavior as a senator. The last set of documents, and the ones that I least expected to see and that were the most revealing, were the personal and professional papers that McCarthy's widow left to Marquette University shortly after his death. They were designed to be made public only when the infant daughter that Joe and Jean left behind, when she said they would become public. For 60 years, she was saying no. For some reason with me, she decided to let me have a look. with the provision that they would become, go back under lock and key when I stopped looking. And those were everything from his real-time World War II handwritten diaries to his love letters to his wannabe wife, Jean, to lots of documents that were stamped top secret that were leaked by the FBI and CIA and make clear just the extraordinary amount of material that McCarthy had at his disposal. And if given those 3 sets of documents, I couldn't write something new and worth seeing, then shame on me, because this was an extraordinary opportunity for a biographer to see all that stuff.
Thanks, Larry. That you're right. You had a lot of new raw material. But one thing I've noticed about biographies from tracking publishing is that every generation seems to need their own view of, important people from the past. And I think maybe there's another reason why your biography is timely now, in that you situate Joe in a tradition of people who use a certain playbook. And would you talk a little bit about that and the idea of how Joe operated is maybe something we're seeing today too?
So I will. And I want to say that I hate when at book talks authors read anything from the book. So I'm only going to read my first line of the book. And the first line of the book is, this is a book about America's love affair with bullies. And that is what the book tries to do. It is a story front and center about Joe McCarthy, but it is called Demagogue because it is a look at this uniquely American strain of demagoguery that was there from the time of our founding fathers. And I'll just give a few familiar names. Huey Long, who was a governor and a senator and a dictator from Louisiana. Theodore Bilbo, who was a racist senator from the Deep South. And a Jew-baiting radio preacher named Father Charles Coughlin, the ultimate anti-Semite from Michigan. Those are some of the demagogues who came before McCarthy. There were demagogues who came afterward with names like George Wallace from Alabama and David Duke from Louisiana. And then there's our 45th president. And I think that every generation does need to take a fresh look at a guy like Joe McCarthy, because every generation produces its own demagogue. And all the demagogues who came after McCarthy, most notably the current one, have borrowed Joe McCarthy's playbook in a way that is profound and is disturbing. And I suggest that the way we want to understand our 45th president is by looking at that playbook that he has borrowed almost to the letter, that was handed to him by a young lawyer from New York who was McCarthy's protege, a guy named Roy Marcus Cohn, who 50 years later became Donald Trump's tutor as he was entering the world of real estate. And to understand Donald Trump, you have to understand both Roy Cohn and, more importantly, his mentor's mentor, Joe McCarthy.
I want to come back to comparing and contrasting Senator McCarthy and the president. But first, let's dig into McCarthy's early life. And I found, I can't say I love McCarthy after reading your book, but I found a deeper appreciation of, there were good qualities he had as a human being, at least early on. Talk a little bit about what McCarthy was like as a boy growing up north of Milwaukee here, and what his early life was like.
So he grew up on a farm just outside of Appleton, Wisconsin, and his early life was incredibly sane and normal, and something that wouldn't have begun to predict what he would become. And I have empathy for McCarthy's parents and for his siblings to have their name go down in infamy as an ism. He grew up on that farm. He left school after the 8th grade and started a poultry empire. He was called the boy chicken tycoon by the leading poultry magazine in America, and had a virus not swept through his flocks, we'd never be reading about Joe McCarthy, the senator. He would have become wealthy and happy as a chicken tycoon. Instead, he went to work for a store that is a 7-Eleven kind of store. It was called the Cashway grocery store. He became an extraordinary young entrepreneur. His store had higher sales than anywhere else in this little kingdom of Cashway stores. But at age 20, he decided that it was time to get more education. And at age 20, he realized he was awfully old to be going back to high school. So he managed to do something that suggested just how smart he was. He completed a full 4 years of high school in a single year. He got into Marquette University. He made his way through Marquette very quickly, first as an engineering student, then as a law student. He managed to get pretty good grades as a law student without studying much at all, because he was enough of a quick study that he could go into his small study group, absorb everything that the students who actually were going to class were learning, and do well on his exams and make it through Marquette with a good record. But what he really wanted to do was go into politics. What he really wanted to do was be noticed. And I want to just tell a very quick story, and this is the long-winded answer to your short question. And the quick story is the first office that Joe McCarthy ever ran for set the template for him. It was when he was running for president of his law school class. He was running against a very good guy named Charlie Curran. And McCarthy and Curran both decided to do what gentlemen did when they were running for an office like that. They agreed to vote for the other one. They would not vote for themselves. They did that. It ended up in a dead tie. And in round 2, McCarthy won by 2 votes. Charlie Curran's vote for him and his vote for himself. When Curran confronted him with this, he said, look, I was telling everybody to vote for the best man for the job, and how could I do that and not vote for myself, the best man? Curran was outraged, but that is where the story normally ends. The story had an epilogue to it. The epilogue is that when Charlie Curran's father died shortly after that, McCarthy was the first guy to come up to him to express his sadness at Curran losing his dad, to ask if there was anything he could do to help Curran make it home for the funeral. And McCarthy ended up borrowing money for gas, borrowing a car, and showing up at the funeral of Charlie Curran's dad. And so for the rest of his life, when Charlie Curran told that story, he told it as McCarthy having this other side to him, which is what you were asking about in the story, the good guy side who would show up at the funeral. And Charlie Curran forgave Joe McCarthy the way an extraordinary number of people would throughout his career. And if it wasn't for that charming side, we would never be able to understand why the state of Wisconsin overwhelmingly elected Joe McCarthy their senator twice. And that is the side that made Joe McCarthy, by 1954, the second most popular public figure in America, trailing only our war hero President Joe McCarthy, our war hero President Dwight Eisenhower. So that was the piece of Joe McCarthy that Ethel Kennedy adored, and the piece of Joe McCarthy that explained why this most vile of characters had the following that he did.
So McCarthy had an athletic pastime that maybe shines a little light on him too. Could you share a little bit about that?
So Joe McCarthy was a pugilist. He was a boxer. He was a successful boxer. He taught high school kids and college kids how to box. And that explained the combative side of Joe McCarthy, the side that would pummel his opponents. And that also explained the side where Joe McCarthy during the day could rake a witness before him over the coals in a way that was destructive to them, not just at that moment, but that helped shatter their self-confidence, often for years to come. And yet, to Joe McCarthy, it was a game like going into the boxing ring. He thought it was okay to pummel his opponent during the fight, but that afterwards they should shake hands and go out for a beer. He would invite out for a beer at night the witnesses that he had destroyed at the hearings during the day. And while I would have loved to have been able to go out for a beer with Joe McCarthy, he was so totally clueless to the destructive effect that he was having on his targets that I see it as inexcusable.
So he started his career as an elected official as a circuit judge. What was he like as a judge?
So as a judge, he probably understood less about the law. After all, he had made it through Marquette on the strength of his classmates' understanding of the law and not on his. He would spend a huge amount of time traveling the circuit court and campaigning for the office that he knew he would someday run for. He knew less about what a judge ought to be doing, which is why he broke every the tenet of how to campaign. It was a nonpartisan office he was running for, and when you were a circuit judge, you were not supposed to run for higher office. But he campaigned twice for senator, once unsuccessfully, once successfully, when he was a judge. He kept his judgeship, the seat, warm while he went off and fought during World War II, which on the one hand was a heroic thing to do, because being a judge would have excused him from being drafted and from having to go and serve in the war. But it also meant that his circuit was down one judge, and his fellow judges were totally distraught at having to do twice the work, because Joe McCarthy had kept his judgeship even when he was off in the South Pacific during the war. And to summarize briefly, he was a successful judge if people liking him was the way he was being judged, and he was a horrible judge if the way he shoved through divorces, if the way he had a misguided sense of what the law was all about, and if knowing the law mattered in being a judge. It was classic Joe McCarthy.
Now, one of the many things I learned from your book was that in addition to patriotic motives, he had a second reason for enlisting in the Marines that might matter to us here in Milwaukee. What was that? What was his other reason for enlisting in the Marines?
So the reason was he had watched the mayor of Milwaukee enlist in the military, and seeing this guy who he saw as his future potential opponent in running for governor or senator, seeing this guy off making a war hero out of himself, made McCarthy realize that during the war, being a young person who sat out the war was not a way to endear yourself to voters. And being able to come back as he did and declare himself Tail Gunner Joe, the war hero, would be something that would help him run for office. Sadly, that mayor of Milwaukee died during the war, and so he was written off as a potential opponent for McCarthy. McCarthy came back and declared himself Tail Gunner Joe. Journalists like you at papers like yours declared him a fraud and said, no, Joe McCarthy, your real assignment during the war in that South Pacific island was a land-based intelligence officer, and you're calling yourself a tail gunner is making up a story. The truth was that he was a land-based intelligence officer, but we now know from his handwritten real-time war diaries that were in his archives at Marquette that he in fact did volunteer for flight after flight to go up as a tail gunner. He put himself at harm's way. We have letters from his comrades in arms saying that they were there with him in the plains, and he was a legitimate war hero, which goes to show two things. One is that when you lie often enough, on the rare occasions with Joe McCarthy that he was telling the truth, nobody would believe him. But the more mysterious question to me is, if the proof of his being a war hero was there in his records at Marquette, and if everybody was calling him a liar, why didn't he just point to the records and say, here's the proof? And I think there was a famous question asked of Joe McCarthy during the famous Army McCarthy hearings, have you no shame, Senator? And I think that McCarthy did have shame. And I think that he decided on something as vital as whether He was a war hero. If people didn't believe them, the heck with them. He wasn't going to stoop to the level of having to pull out his old diary and say, here's the proof. That's one theory, and the one I believe in. Other people have offered a different theory, which is if he had pulled out one set of proof from those personal and professional papers, people would have asked him to prove other things that he couldn't prove, and he didn't want to tell people, I really have all this stuff here that could either prove or disprove whether I'm telling the truth.
And as you point out in your book, while he was in the Marines, he was flagrantly violating their rules on no political activity by campaigning by proxy back home for higher office.
He had shameless banners strung across his tent, across his truck, saying McCarthy for US Senate. And that was a violation of logic. It was a violation of his oath of office as a judge, and it was a violation of edicts that the military made very clear to everybody who was signing up. Thou shalt not campaign for office when you're serving your country. He ignored them. He was shameless.
Before I get to my next question, Larry, I just want to remind listeners that if you do have questions for Larry, please type them in the chat box, and Christina will help navigate those to us. So his second Senate race in Wisconsin, and his first victory, you described that as one of the most momentous Senate races in American history, would you say?
Sure, I would say American history. I would definitely say Wisconsin history, but I say American history partly because that race was one where a titan of Wisconsin politics, somebody whose family meant to Wisconsin what the Kennedys do in my native Massachusetts to Massachusetts. It was a family called La Follette, and young Bob La Follette, the son of fighting Bob La Follette, who had been a senator for a long time. Young Bob had been a senator from Wisconsin for decades. He was an extraordinary senator, one of the most noble people in the US Senate, one of the icons for Bobby Kennedy when he would later become a senator. And McCarthy toppled La Follette. So it was an important election, partly because we gave up one of the most noble and progressive senators in American history for one of the most malevolent senators in American history. It was also an extraordinary race because Joe McCarthy, who when he ran for his first office, district attorney from his native Appleton, he ran as a Democrat and as an FDR-loving New Deal liberal Democrat. When he realized that he was never going to get elected to office from his part of Wisconsin as a Democrat, and certainly not as a liberal Democrat, probably in the middle of the night sometime, he quietly changed his registration to Republican. And when he ran against La Follette in that Republican primary, he had to run from the right. La Follette had the left, the liberal part of the Republican Party sewn up. So shamelessly, Joe McCarthy went from being a liberal Democrat to being what Wisconsin called a stalwart Republican, a very conservative Republican. He ran a campaign that was partly about the issues, but partly about being willing to do anything to get elected. He lied about La Follette, and it worked, and he won, and he set the template for himself and for all the demagogues who would look at his playbook. And it was a very sad time in Wisconsin politics. There's one postscript to that. Years later, he threatened to bring La Follette, who he had beaten, back in front of his subcommittee to testify about alleged communists who had worked for La Follette when he was a senator. That so unnerved La Follette that as his son, Bronson La Follette, who died recently, who was the Attorney General of Wisconsin, as his son describes it, that is why Bob La Follette went into his office, took a gun out, put it to his head, and killed himself. That he was one of the many victims of Joe McCarthy who were so undone by Senator McCarthy that they actually committed suicide.
Larry, when McCarthy first got to the Senate, how was he received by his colleagues there?
He was ignored by his colleagues there. He was somebody who came in as a very energetic upstart who ignored all the rules that the Senate operated under. And the Senate was then and is still today a kind of closed club where rules matter. And somebody like McCarthy, who comes in and throws bombshells, is somebody that they try to ignore and that they despise. And Joe McCarthy is somebody that looked like he was on his way to being a shoo-in to being a one-term senator until a fateful day in February of 1950.
I would like to ask you to set that up for us. McCarthy gave what's now a famous speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, and you point out in your book that he had two possible speeches he could have given that night. Talk about the event and McCarthy's decision.
Sure. So one of the most important days on the calendar in America, if you were a Republican, is Abraham Lincoln's birthday. And every Republican party, small and large, across the country, uses that as an occasion to raise money and raise the energy level of the faithful. And if you're a prominent Republican, you get invited to places like Boston and New York, Washington, and maybe Milwaukee. If you were Joe McCarthy, you got invited to Wheeling, as his staff called it, Wheeling, West Bygard, Virginia. And he shows up in Wheeling that night, as you say, with a briefcase containing two speeches. One is a snoozer of a speech on national housing policy, an issue that McCarthy actually knew something about. Had he delivered that speech that night, Jim, you and I would not be here 70 years later talking about Joe McCarthy. He would have become that one-term senator and he would have been forgotten. But instead, he reached into his briefcase, he pulled out speech number 2, and he held up a sheaf of papers in his hand and said, I have here in my hand a list of 205 spies at the US State Department. They are people who are undermining American security, and I'm going to count them, I'm going to name them, and I'm going to call on President Truman to root them out of the State Department. Now, what he had in his speech that night could have been anything. I went through all of his records. I saw 25 versions of that speech. What we know he didn't have was a list of 205 spies in the State Department. And that's because there weren't 205 spies in the State Department. Instead, McCarthy recycled a lot of names of people, many of whom had never worked in the State Department, most of whom didn't still work in the State Department, and almost none of them, and probably none of them, were ever a spy. They might have had a sister-in-law or a brother-in-law who had been a leftist at some point in their life. They might have been involved with the Communist Party 25 years before when they were flirting with their political identity when they were in college. But it didn't matter to Joe McCarthy, because reporters like ones at your newspaper and newspapers all across America loved the idea of 205 spies in the State Department. They put Joe McCarthy on page 1 of every newspaper in America, and he never looked back. And I want to just say one last thing about that list that he held in his hand. Over the next week, the numbers changed. 205 one night, 207 another, and my favorite number was 57. And where did the number 57 come from? We have no idea, but the theory of one of his friends that I love is that Joe McCarthy, who loved hamburgers and steaks, stopped off at a steakhouse before one of his talks. He used Heinz 57 sauce. That was a number that stuck in his mind, and why not 57? He was never going to show anybody the list anyway, so he could pick out any number he liked.
Any Pittsburgh native would tell you 57 is Heinz. You know, we would all know that. So, one thing that's different about that era than today was there was, in spite of the attention this generated, there was very little coverage of the actual speech he gave, right? Was there any live coverage of it?
So there was coverage, and that raises the issue of one more reason why Joe McCarthy picked Wheeling, West Virginia to unload this barn burner of a speech on communists at the State Department. He rightfully knew that the only reporters would be there would be one from the Wheeling Intelligencer newspaper, from the local radio station, and an Associated Press reporter. He knew that these reporters would have no clue on who to call for comment at the State Department. And he knew that if he delivered it as a dinner speech, even if they had a clue on who to call in Washington, they wouldn't have had time. So he would release his most damning and inflammatory information out on the hustings, where he knew that there would be no chance that anybody would really be able to call him on it. And he loved the idea that his story would make page one the next day, and the response, the story that had the other side of the charges, would make page 24 a day later. And that's where Joe McCarthy wanted the rebuttal and wanted himself.
Larry, to what extent do you think his method was instinctive, and to what extent calculated?
So it was instinctively calculated. He had no playbook of anybody else. He was not a guy who would have really studied Huey Long or Father Coughlin to see what they had done. He was not a guy who had the patience to really study anybody, but he had a natural instinct for the cowboy-like technique. People who came before him, the people who ran committees like the House Un-American Activities Committee, had named communists, but they never had the sense that Joe McCarthy did. If you counted them and named long lists of them, that it would appeal to journalists. They never had his sense of chutzpah in being willing to say or do whatever it took to keep him on page one. And they never had his sense that you never had to really unmask a single communist that mattered to be called the father of the Red Scare and to be the one whose name became an ism. It was said about Joe McCarthy back then that he could have been dropped into the middle of Red Square on May Day and not recognized a real communist. And I think that was true.
And we should probably remind people just how intense the Cold War atmosphere of the period was, that this was not long after Stalin announced that Russia had nuclear weapons, right?
Right. So this was in the era that we discussed, the duck and cover era, the era of Red China, the era of the Rosenbergs. And like every demagogue, Joe McCarthy understood real fears. And like every demagogue, rather than giving us a program to really do something about those fears, to confront the Soviet menace, he gave us scapegoats and he pointed fingers. Looking at Joe McCarthy's list of 205 communists did nothing to make America safer, which is why his Senate colleagues very quickly labeled what he was doing a fraud and a hoax. But that didn't stop Joe.
So how did he gain power over subcommittees to berate people in public?
Well, he watched his party go from being a minority party to, in the Eisenhower landslide of 1952, become a majority committee. And Joe McCarthy took a subcommittee that nobody had paid much attention to, called the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, which had the power, he realized, to investigate anything that he could label as a threat to the country. And he got that subcommittee because nobody else especially wanted it. And he subverted its purpose in a way that only Joe McCarthy could do. And he made it all about investigating communists rather than investigating corruption in the government or investigating the president. And if you had no morality, he was an amoral enough guy. And if you had no ethics that bound you, and if you had no respect for traditions of the Senate or the country, you could be out there doing just what Joe McCarthy did, which was out there pointing fingers, out there throwing bombshells, out there charming the press when that worked and attacking them when the news got bad.
And we'll get back to that love feast between Joe and the press in a minute, but I wanted to ask you, who are some of the other targets he went after on his witch hunt?
So I would have mentioned three of them very quickly. One was gays, and there was what he called or what people rightfully called the lavender scare. And Joe McCarthy, with his gay sidekick, Roy Cohn, was vicious in attacking gays in the government. And he attacked them under the pretense that if you were gay and if you were closeted and if you were in a sensitive position in the government, you would be ripe for being recruited by the Soviets. They could blackmail you. Well, if there was anybody in the American government who was subject to blackmail, it was a senator named Joe McCarthy, who was a heavy gambler, who was a heavy drinker, and whose behavior outside of the Senate chamber made him incredibly vulnerable to being blackmailed. The second group Joe McCarthy went after was Jews, and he was, from his earliest days in the Senate to his use of slur words like Heb and Sheeny, to his disproportionate attack against alleged communists in the government in terms of going after Jews in the army and elsewhere. Joe McCarthy was, I think, unabashedly anti-Semitic. And yes, he hired a smart young aide named Roy Cohn, but he told his friends he hired this Jewish lawyer from New York to protect him against charges from the Anti-Defamation League and others that he was an anti-Semite. So I think he was an anti-Semite and a cynic. And the third group that he went after were Eastern elites, as he called them. And that meant anybody on Wall Street. That meant anybody who went to an Ivy League or any other elite school from the East. And that meant people who a Midwestern populist could get people to believe that were antagonistic to their interests. And that was endemic to demagogues in America, going after real elites and non-existent elites, and being able to say that you were an anti-elitist was just part of trying to appeal to populist roots, and it worked.
And one fascinating side note here is that roughly the same time that he hired Roy Cohn, he hired another ambitious young attorney on his staff, didn't he?
So he hired a guy named David Shine, who wasn't an attorney and who wasn't much of anything other than Roy Cohn's pal, but that was enough for Joe McCarthy to hire him. And he became part of the reason for Joe McCarthy's downfall. This guy, David Shine, was drafted into the Army. Roy Cohn and Joe McCarthy asked for all kinds of special treatment to get him out of the normal duty, everything from kitchen patrol to other duties that were unpleasant. They got him endless. The permissions to go off and party in New York with Roy Cohn. And at some point, the Army decided that they had had enough of giving him special treatment. And that was one of the reasons we ended up with the famous Army McCarthy hearings that were Joe McCarthy's downfall.
And actually, Larry, I was thinking of another person he hired around that time.
I'm sorry.
Oh, that's good.
Yes.
That was
Thank
good.
you. So no, that's very good. The other person was the guy that we started out this conversation with, Ethel Kennedy's husband, the guy named Bobby Kennedy. And Bobby Kennedy, who graduated smack in the middle of his class at University of Virginia Law School, when he finished law school, needed a job. And he did what the Kennedys always did when they needed something. He went to Papa Joe and said, I need a job. And Joe Kennedy had given enough money to Joe McCarthy that when Joe Kennedy picked up the phone and called Joe McCarthy and said, hire my son, Joe McCarthy said, sure. And the only question was whether he would get the #1 job or the #2 job on that subcommittee. We can only imagine what would have happened had Bobby Kennedy, instead of Roy Cohn, gotten the #1 job, but instead he got the second job. Bobby Kennedy stayed on for nearly 6 months. He stayed loyal to Joe McCarthy for the rest of his life. And whereas Joe McCarthy started his political life as a New Deal Democrat and became a conservative Republican, Bobby Kennedy started his political life as a Joe McCarthy loving, Cold Warrior. He was a Democrat, but he was a very conservative Democrat, and Bobby Kennedy, as we know, ended up his life as an iconic liberal. But before he got there, he became buddies and friends and a great defender to the end of Joe McCarthy's life of his buddy, Joe McCarthy.
And as you've written about, he even snuck into town for Joe's funeral.
He did. And it was, so Bobby Kennedy came in to Appleton, Wisconsin, came in actually to Green Bay, Wisconsin, that had the airport, aboard a big plane with lots of Republicans. He let all the Republicans get off the plane. He then quietly got off that airplane, bummed a ride from Green Bay to Appleton with a reporter from your newspaper, the Milwaukee newspaper. He went to the church service and stood up in the choir loft where nobody would see him. He went to the graveside service and stood away from all the dignitaries where nobody would see him. After the service, he begged all the reporters who were there not to name him in their stories. He said, "I'll get in trouble with my big brother Jack," who obviously wanted to be president, by being at the funeral of this conservative Republican, and all the reporters agreed that they wouldn't name him. 50 years later, thankfully, I came across the reporter from the Milwaukee paper who had felt guilty for all those years for not naming McCarthy in that story. He told me about not naming Bobby Kennedy in that story. He told me about Bobby Kennedy's having it both ways, protecting his brother Jack by not being in the story, and being loyal to his pal Joe McCarthy by being at his funeral.
Now, as you fairly point out in your book, the American news media, newspapers, had a big role in making McCarthy powerful. But there were also some that tried to hold him to task and criticize his methods.
Yes, so they did. And what happened to them is they got the McCarthy steamroller effect. The first one who called him a fraud and a hoax was a senator from Maryland named Millard Tydings. Tydings was up for, that was in the spring of 1950. That November, Tydings was up for re-election. Tydings was as strong and powerful a senator as La Follette was in Wisconsin. McCarthy came in, recruited a know-nothing Republican to run against him, recruited all of his Texas oil baron friends to finance this Republican's campaign in Maryland, gave the Republican candidate Joe's bag of dirty tricks. Tydings lost. McCarthy sent out a clarion signal to every other senator: you take me on at your own risk. And very few took him on after that.
Now, as a Milwaukee Journal Sentinel reporter, one thing I loved reading about in your book was how the Milwaukee Journal covered some of McCarthy's speeches, including what we would call in-house today politifacting some of them. Could you talk about how the Journal covered McCarthy?
Yes, so the Journal was one of the proudest newspapers in America in terms of being willing to take on Joe McCarthy at a time when very few did. And they would cover, when McCarthy came to town, they would essentially be on a McCarthy watch. They would stake him out. They would make sure that they were there in case he did anything outrageous. But they also sent reporters to his speeches. And what happened to those reporters at times is he would publicly call them out. He would say, there is a reporter here from the Milwaukee paper, and we know what we think about the Milwaukee paper. And it would become truly dangerous for that reporter. It was like being at a Trump speech and having Donald Trump call you out. And that was not a position that any reporter wanted to be in. The Milwaukee reporters and the other reporters in the state never backed down. They never were, thankfully, attacked, but it sure looked like they might be at times. And it was not a pleasant situation.
All right, Larry, you've given me the opening for this question. You make some comparisons between Senator McCarthy and 45 in the book. So Compare and contrast them for me as both as politicians and what you can tell about them as persons.
So intentionally, I only mentioned Donald Trump's name in the preface and the epilogue to the book. But one could argue that there are very few pages in the book where we're talking about Joe McCarthy that you couldn't imagine that we were talking about Donald Trump. I want to mention just a couple quick things that make me think that there are similarities and that it's not an accident that Trump looks like he is using Joe McCarthy's playbook. Both of them are brilliant at scapegoating their enemies. And I think that with both of them, they understood that there was a real fear. In McCarthy's case, it was communism. In Trump's case, it is the economic dislocation that lots of Americans felt despite the prosperity at the time that he was running in 2016. But again, instead of offering solutions, they offered scapegoats. They would both never have any shame. And when one bombshell that they had unloaded was proven to be hollow, the next day they would lob a fresh bombshell. With both of them, when the news got bad, they would blame the newsmen and newswomen. But I want to read you two quotes, two of my favorite quotes that suggest the link between McCarthy and Trump. One is what may have been the most famous words that Donald Trump uttered as a candidate in 2016. And anybody listening now will, I suspect, remember these words. Trump told his supporters, "I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters." Those words were such dynamite that every newspaper in America printed them, every TV station broadcast his saying that. Exactly 62 years before, the polling pioneer George Gallup said something chillingly similar about Joe McCarthy's supporters. Gallup said, and I quote, "Even if it were known that McCarthy had killed 5 innocent children, his supporters probably would still go along with him." I think those kinds of echoes are not an accident. And I think that the protege of Joe McCarthy, Roy Marcus Cohn, who was Donald Trump's tutor 50 years before, passed on all the lessons that McCarthy had taught Cohn to Donald Trump. Trump says every time he's been in trouble for the last 3.5 years, he has said, "I wish I had at my side Roy Cohn." What I think he's really saying, only it would be too politically unpalatable to say it, is I wish I had at my side Roy Cohn's mentor, Joe McCarthy.
So what ultimately was his undoing, McCarthy's undoing?
McCarthy's undoing was taking on an enemy that was too big to bully, the US Army. At the end of 1953, McCarthy accused a particular Army base called Fort Monmouth in New Jersey of housing a bunch of nests of communist moles. McCarthy initially got the Army support and they said, "You give us the names and we'll suspend them and investigate them." The Army finally realized that McCarthy was giving them bad names. He was giving them ever increasing numbers of names, and he was asking for special treatment for his young aide, David Shine. McCarthy, by early 1954, developed the beginnings of a backbone. President Eisenhower, who had been coddling McCarthy for nearly a year and a half, finally developed the beginnings of a backbone. And the famous Army McCarthy hearings, McCarthy's charges against the Army were investigated. The Army's charges against McCarthy were investigated. Halfway through the hearings, the lawyer from Boston, a really smart, short lawyer from the Midwest named Joe Welch, asked McCarthy what may have been the most famous question that a lawyer has ever asked in an American courtroom or a hearing room. It was the question, "Senator McCarthy, have you no sense of decency? At long last, have you no decency?" McCarthy had gone after Attorney Welch's young associate, accused him of being a communist, and Welch asked that question, very famous question. A lot of people who were watching those hearings thought that that question was the turning point in the hearings and in McCarthy's career. What looked like an ad-lib, spontaneous question was one that Welch actually had in his back pocket throughout the hearings. He knew Joe McCarthy would do something suggesting he had no sense of decency. He was ready to pull out that question whenever the circumstances let him do it. But I think it wasn't that question that undid Joe McCarthy. It was Americans watching night after night this guy who they thought was their champion look like the town rowdy, and seeing this bullying character. All of America wanted to know by the time Joe Welch asked his question whether this senator had any sense of decency. McCarthy begins the hearings with a full 50% of America thinking he's doing a great job. By the end of the hearings that summer of 1954, his popularity had plummeted from 50% to 34%. He looked vulnerable. That is when his fellow senators finally developed some courage. By December of 1954, they censured him, and by the end of 1954, Joe McCarthy was a walking political basket case. He lived for 2.5 more years. He served as a senator for 2.5 more years, but his career, for all intents and purposes, ended with the hearings and his censure, and his drinking picked up, and McCarthy essentially drank himself to death.
So Larry, as you suggest with both the title and what you've talked about here today, you see Joe as a type, as an almost representing an archetype of a kind of politician. And what, I know you're not a civics teacher, but what lesson can we draw from his type in dealing with politicians like that today?
So we can draw the lesson that sadly, we are as vulnerable as we were in the 1950s to demagogues. I thought, again, that it was a story that we had outgrown this sense of bullying. We're much better at having outgrown bullies in the classroom than we are bullies in our political life. But my book, even though it is about a vile character, a sinister character like Joe McCarthy, it is in the end a good news story. And the good news from the Joe McCarthy story is that throughout our long history, every demagogue given the rope eventually hangs themselves. And given the time, America, while we buy into bullies and demagogues, we eventually see through them and get rid of them. And that to me is a good news story that I hope applies today to the same way it did in the 1950s and beyond.
Larry, the author should have the closing statement, of course. And so I'm wondering what maybe I didn't ask you about you would want our Milwaukee Public Library listeners to know about your book.
So I want people who are from Wisconsin to know that we should never hold Joe McCarthy against them, because it wasn't just your state that bought into Joe McCarthy, it was all of us. And your state ended up making amends by electing one of its most progressive senators ever, a guy named Proxmire, to take Joe McCarthy's seat in the Senate. And I came away from Wisconsin seeing that it had many nuances to its politics today, the same way it did in the 1950s. And I came away loving Wisconsin, and I came away wishing that I could have been there today as I had planned to be when the Democrats were meeting in Milwaukee and when I had set up a bunch of book talks. I want to say just one last thing. I will not be presumptuous enough to say that people should buy my book. People can decide whether or not to buy my book, but I will be presumptuous enough to say that if anybody wants to buy the book, they should buy it from Boswell Books in Milwaukee. And if anybody cares about it, I had hoped to be there doing a book signing. If you care about it and you ask Dan at Boswell Books, I will send you a signature plate to at least have a pseudo kind of signing. And I want to say that Jim Higgins proved himself today to be the great questioner and reporter that he is. And I want to thank the Milwaukee Public Library for having in this guy with a Boston accent to do a talk for you there today.
All right, Christina, I think we can turn the microphone back over to you if you're still out there.
Hi, yes, thank you. And thank you to everyone who submitted questions. So we do have a couple questions here for you, Larry. Can you give an example of how McCarthy questioned people in his hearings, and what was Eisenhower's reaction to the hearings?
Sure. So what McCarthy's question was, the thing that most people in the history books tell us is his most famous question is, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? His actually most famous question, and the one that if anybody was aware of it at the time, they would have been most afraid of, is when he would, after hearing their testimony, he would utter these famous words, "in other words." And in other words was an excuse for him to go and redefine what somebody had said to give it its most sinister characterization. He would basically take somebody's denial and cause them say that that was just proof that they were a liar. He would, if they declared themselves to be taking the Fifth Amendment, meaning the amendment that would protect them against self-incrimination, he would call them to their face a Fifth Amendment communist, suggesting that the very notion of their taking the Fifth Amendment suggested not just that they had something to hide, but that they must be a spy for the Soviet Union. It was extraordinary the way he could take their words and read into them something that was not there in their words.
Thank you. And then can you speak a bit about what Eisenhower's reaction to the hearings was?
So Eisenhower, from the day he took office, recognized that Joe McCarthy was a bully. And Eisenhower's brother, Dwight's brother, Milton Eisenhower, whispered in Dwight's ear from day one, give up a tiny bit of your enormous popularity and take down that bully. And Eisenhower said, no, that we have to wait for Joe McCarthy to do himself in. And Eisenhower was right that McCarthy would eventually do himself in. But that was ignoring the fact that a dozen people would commit suicide, hundreds of people would watch their careers be smashed, and millions of people would be silenced for fear of looking like they were the kind of red that Joe McCarthy was going after. And so Eisenhower's reaction to McCarthy was, let's wait him out. His reaction to the hearings that did McCarthy in were, I told you he would do himself in. But I think one of the few things that the very proud Dwight Eisenhower ever regretted in his political life was not having had the courage to take on McCarthy. Historians justified what Eisenhower did. I think Eisenhower knew it was unjustifiable, especially when McCarthy went after Dwight Eisenhower's buddy, General, why am I blanking? General George Marshall, a famous World War II five-star general who McCarthy trashed and who Eisenhower had a speech defending, but he never read that speech and he never stood up the way he should have for General George Marshall.
Thank you. Our next question is, how much do you think McCarthy's Catholic upbringing played in shaping his anti-communism?
So I would say the same thing about that I did about what I said about Wisconsin. While McCarthy's strongest political support always came from the Catholic community, and while many Catholics were strong anti-communists, I would never blame McCarthy on the Catholic community. McCarthy had outspoken Catholic leaders who denounced him. He had, McCarthy, to his credit, never played on his Catholic roots in trying to build support among the Catholic community. And I think that Catholics can't be blamed for Joe McCarthy any more than Wisconsin voters can be. It was America that enabled Joe McCarthy, people of every state and every religion, and we are the ones ultimately who are to blame when a demagogue gets the kind of 50% support across the country that Joe McCarthy managed to garner.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more question. Did McCarthy have an end game other than getting attention?
So I think that's a great question. And I think most demagogues, whether they're named George Wallace or Huey Long or Joe McCarthy or Donald Trump, one of the things that characterizes demagogues is they generally don't have any political program. Their program and their aim is to get power and to hold on to power. But Joe McCarthy didn't know 10 minutes ahead what his politics were going to look like, not to mention at the end of some grand scheme. And Joe McCarthy managed to gain power based on a political program that he knew was a fraud. And sadly, at the end of his life, one of the few people who still believed in this program that had been exposed as a fraud was Joe McCarthy. He went from being a cynic and an opportunist and knowing that he was lying to, by the end, repeating his charges with such mind-numbing repetition that he actually believed them by the end, and so did his wife, Jean.
All right, well, thank you so much, everyone in the audience, for sharing those really wonderful questions. I'm just going to close things out by thanking once again Larry and Jim for that really riveting conversation. I want to encourage everyone to visit Boswell Books online or give them a call to purchase Larry's book. And thank you for joining in and supporting Milwaukee Public Library.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Bye.
Bye-bye.